I welcome you once again to Audit Snapshots. I'm Christine, and in this playlist, we will simplify each phase of the audit process with clear concept maps. Whether you're brushing up on your knowledge or gearing up for that big exam, you'll find useful inputs here for sure. If, however, you desire a more detailed approach a la undergrad classroom discussion, feel free to check out the related playlists in my YouTube channel, Let's Talk Audit and Assurance. So, what are you waiting for? Let's dive in and give our audit knowledge database that much needed boost. As I welcome you once again to another snapshot version, this time we are going to talk about the financial statements audit, client acceptance, audit planning, supervision, and monitoring. And yes, I agree with you, that is quite a mouthful. And while we enjoy the occasional buffet or two, I know that right now what we're really craving for is bite sized. And so for this snapshot version, we are first going to focus on the financial statements audit, risk based audit approach, and the audit risk model. And the star of the show, of course, is FS audit. Now, the financial statement audit may be approached by the auditor from either the traditional route or the risk based route. So, what's the difference between traditional and risk based approach? Well, it's all about the focus. If you talk about the traditional FS audit, the focus is more on testing. The auditor is obsessed with testing, and the auditor therefore endeavors to comprehensively test all significant transactions and balances using standardized procedures. Let me just point out, it doesn't say test all transactions, but rather test all significant transactions and balances using standardized procedures. The auditor therefore allocates the audit resources, including his or her time, equally across all significant transactions and balances to ensure that they are tested. However, in terms of the risk based FS audit, the auditor's focus is targeted testing. Having said that, it is risk driven. The auditor then allocates his resources and time to the areas which pose the highest level of risk. Significance is therefore placed on risk assessment. And the risk based FS audit is going to be the approach that we will be using whenever we talk about financial statement audit across our discussions on auditing theory. Now, this particular approach is characterized by three distinct phases. We, of course, start with risk assessment, where the auditor identifies the risk and also evaluates the risk. This will help the auditor determine if there are risks of material misstatement. After that, of course, once the auditor has assessed the risk, the auditor cannot just sit idly by, right? The auditor has to respond to the risk, giving birth to the second distinct phase, which is risk response. And here we will get to see the auditor's many different audit procedures in order to address the risks that have been previously assessed. Finally, it will be capped off, tied neatly with a bow, in conclusion and reporting, of course. Let's put our focus now on risk assessment. And what better way to do that than to push to the screen our beloved audit risk model? Now, I know you're very familiar with AR equals IR times CR times DR. And when we talk about AR or audit risk, this refers to the possibility that the auditor gives an inappropriate conclusion, an inappropriate opinion on the financial statements which are materially misstated. This then supports the fact that the audit is not perfect. And we know that the audit is not perfect because, in the first place, it can only provide reasonable assurance, never absolute assurance, never absolute assurance. And perhaps we still get to ask the question, why can it not provide absolute assurance? Why only reasonable assurance? Well, because the audit has inherent limitations. And when we say inherent limitations, these are built in limitations to an audit that I would like to summarize by SIN cube. So just to remind us that it is not the sin or the fault of the auditor why an absolute assurance cannot be given. So what are these inherent limitations? Well, we start with the use of testing. When the auditor performs the auditor utilizes audit sampling. And the use of sampling, and we know a sample to be a smaller subset of the population, right? When the auditor does not test everything, then there is a possibility that the items or transactions which were not tested may have contained the misstatement. And this gives rise to sampling risk. Another thing that we need to recognize is that the data that we are auditing, the data that we are examining, are actually products of the client's internal control system. And having said that, the client's internal control system also has its own inherent limitations. So the inherent limitations of our client's internal control system also contributes to the inherent limitations of our audit. Now, let's just assume that the auditor is able to test everything. Do you think the auditor can now give absolute assurance? The answer is, of course not, because there will always be human error, and that is represented by non-sampling risk. Risks not involving the use of sample, such as, for example, risks born out of the auditor's poor judgment or the auditor's lack of proper planning, the use of ineffective procedures, or simply the inability to properly interpret the results of the testing, all contribute to non-sampling risk. And it is the very presence of this human error that makes the audit also imperfect. Then we talk about the nature of evidence. And the nature of audit evidence is that it is persuasive rather than conclusive, meaning to say it simply convinces us that what we are seeing supports what management is saying, but it is not a conclusive evidence. Lastly, we talk about the nature of assertions. Now, in the conduct of our audit, there are certain assertions whereby we can use or we can only use management's representations as our main evidence. The nature of assertions being that they are made by management, and whether we like it or not, management will always have some form of bias towards the FS which they are responsible for, right? And so because we make use of these assertions, actually we test these assertions. So the nature of the assertion also contributes to the inherent limitations of an audit. So that, my friends, simply explain to us why the audit is not perfect. We now move on to the first component of our audit risk model, and that is, of course, inherent risk. The word inherent implies something that is intrinsic, something that is built in, something that is by its very nature. And so, therefore, when we talk about inherent risk, we talk about no controls in place. We assume there are no controls in place. We let the transaction, we let the event, we let the business behave in its natural habitat, assuming no controls in place. And inherent risk is assessed at both the FS level and the assertion level. So, what do we mean by this? When we talk about the FS level, just imagine the macro level. Can you think about businesses which are highly regulated? Say, for example, insurance companies, which compare that with businesses which are not highly regulated, like maybe simple commercial merchandising entities, then I think you will agree with me that highly regulated businesses like insurance companies or pre-need companies pose a higher level of inherent risk at the FS level. Another way of looking at it will be perhaps looking at the entity's economic climate, or when or a particular entity's economic environment or economic climate would also affect the entity's inherent risk at the FS level. So FS level refers to the macro level. At the assertion level, on the other hand, we get to talk about transactions, balances, and events. Say, for example, between cash and office supplies, well, then most definitely cash will be more prone to theft, right? Or accounting for leases versus accounting for prepaid insurance, then most definitely accounting for leases would be more complex and complicated and would thus exhibit a higher level of inherent risk. So, once again, when we talk about inherent risk, we assume there are no controls in place. And remember, this is assessed at both the FS level, the macro level. You talk about the nature of the entity, you talk about the governance of the entity, everything that affects the entirety of the FS, we call that FS level. And at the assertion level, when we now talk about balances, transactions, and events. Now, after inherent risk, we have what we call control risk. And control risk essentially reflects the fact that internal controls are not perfect. This is in relation to The second inherent limitation to an audit that we mentioned, where there are also inherent limitations of the client's internal controls. Now, our client's internal control system, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how well designed, and no matter how expensive they are, to design and implement, they are also not perfect. In that, internal controls can also only provide reasonable assurance. And we get to notice this one. Whenever we mention reasonable assurance, there will always be a subsequent discussion on the inherent limitations. Why are internal controls not perfect? Because of the following inherent limitations that I would like to summarize by the mnemonic SHOCCR. Shocker. What a shocker, right? So here are the inherent limitations to a client's internal control system. Well, number one, internal control systems, and systems are vulnerable to breakdowns. So the first inherent limitation is the always the vulnerability to a system breakdown. Internal controls are also designed and implemented by human beings. Even the most digital controls always have a human component, and so therefore human error and human limitations would also contribute to the inherent limitations of internal controls. Another inherent limitation is the possibility of override. To make this one complete, it's the possibility of management override. Now, we know management is in a position of power to pause the controls. And the moment the controls are paused, the moment the controls are overridden, then the misstatements could very well come in unfiltered. So the possibility of management override also renders the controls to be imperfect. Other than that, there is also the possibility of collusion. Now, I know that you are a little bit familiar or quite familiar with the concept of segregation of duties, right? Where crucial functions have to be performed at the optimal level by different people to ensure that no one commits fraud and gets away with it unnoticed. Pretty neat, huh? However, if you think about it, what if the duties are segregated, but then all of those occupying the different positions will collude, will connive in order to render the controls ineffective. So, there, the possibility of collusion would also override the effectiveness of the controls. And we acknowledge that there will always be cost benefit considerations. After all, will the presence of internal controls are intended to help the business meet its objectives. Therefore, it follows the business objectives. So objectives first, right? And so therefore, the business cannot afford to invest heavily on internal controls if it will just make their business go bankrupt. And so there will always be cost benefit trade-offs, and that will of course lead to imperfect controls. And lastly, internal controls are directed towards routine transactions. So much so that if the business encounters a transaction that is out of the ordinary, then internal controls are rendered incapable to address the said extraordinary or unusual transactions. So all of these contribute to the inherent limitations of internal controls. Now, we are saying actually that inherent risk, and sorry, before we go there, internal controls or control risk are assessed at the assertion level. So, we generally talk about control risk at the micro assertion level, but we also consider it at the FS level. Because later on, when we talk about the components of internal controls, we get to see things like the control environment, information and communication systems, which are actually entity level controls. So we consider this at the FS level or at the entity level, but this is assessed at the assertion level. When you talk about the assertions, when you talk about transactions, when you talk about balances, that is where we normally assess control risk, but considered still at the FS level. Now, we are saying that inherent risk and control risk are actually quite unique in that collectively we call them the risk of material misstatement, and its nature is that it cannot be controlled by the auditor. It's uncontrollable by the auditor. With or without the audit, you can't change the fact that certain businesses are more risky than others, certain transactions, certain events, certain balances are more risky than others. You cannot also change the fact, with or without the audit, you can't change the fact that internal controls are not perfect. And because both of these are uncontrollable by the auditor can only assess them. Collectively, we call them the risk of material misstatement. Now, One thing I would like to point out with you regards the risk of material misstatement is that RMMs can actually be the source or is the source for that which we call significant risk. Now, significant risk is an identified RMM or risk of material misstatement where the inherent risk assessment is in the upper quadrant, meaning to say, when the auditor assessed this RMM in terms of inherent risk, there is a high likelihood for the risk to happen and there is a high impact should that risk happen. Now, when the PSAs or the ISAs refer to the upper quadrant, they actually simply mean this. When you open, for example, the x-axis and the y-axis, perhaps looking at impact versus likelihood, when we talk about significant risk, they are at the upper quadrant. So they represent these data points. Okay, so once again, significant risk must be number one, an identified risk of material misstatement, and number two, they must belong to the upper quadrant of the inherent risk assessment for impact versus likelihood. So that's risk assessment. Now, you may have noticed we have set aside detection risk for now because detection risk will belong to risk response. So, when we talk about detection risk, this is the risk that the auditor is willing to accept of not detecting misstatements. Actually, the beauty of detection risk is that it can be controlled by the auditor. Whereas the auditor might feel a little bit helpless when we talk about the risk of material misstatement, the auditor will be happy with detection risk because the auditor can control detection risk. And to signify the auditor's power to control detection risk, we call it the acceptable level of detection risk. So actually in the audit risk model, when we see DR there, that actually means the acceptable level of detection risk. And since the auditor can control detection risk, the auditor also therefore sets audit risk at the desired level. So the complete way to look at the audit risk model is desired level of audit risk is equal to inherent risk times control risk times the acceptable level of detection risk. Now, detection risk per se is the risk that the auditor's procedures will not be able to detect misstatements in transactions, balances, and events. Notice a difference in the terminology. When we talk about audit risk, this is the risk that the auditor gives an inappropriate opinion on the financial statements, macro level, right? But when we talk about detection risk, this is the risk that the auditor's procedures will not be able to detect misstatements of transactions, balances, and events. It's on a more micro level. And so, therefore, when you talk about the acceptable level of detection risk, this is the risk that you are willing to accept of not being able to detect the misstatements. And how does the auditor exercise or how does the auditor respond to this willingness? We have to understand that the acceptable level of detection risk actually bears an inverse relationship to audit effort. So if you think about it, if the risk of material misstatement is high, but you still chose to accept that client, then the auditor's acceptable level of detection risk should be low in order to balance the whole equation, right? Again, if the risk of material misstatement is high and the auditor still chose to accept that client, then the auditor must set his acceptable level of detection risk to low in order to balance the equation. Now, when the auditor sets the acceptable level of detection risk to a low level, that means the auditor is going to be very strict in the conduct of the audit. And because the auditor wishes to embrace a more strict approach, then the auditor's audit effort will be magnified. The auditor will have more extensive testing. And I think it makes sense, right? If you accept a client that has a lot of red flags, then you must do a lot of testing in order to somehow mitigate the risk that you have identified. So therefore, the acceptable level of detection risk bears an inverse relationship. On the contrary, if the risk of material misstatement is low because the client's business is relatively straightforward, the controls are relatively good as well, the design is good, the implementation, the operating effectiveness shows strong controls, then the auditor will set the acceptable level, I repeat, acceptable level of detection risk to high. So if the auditor is willing to accept a high level of risk, then the auditor will be on chill mode. And because the auditor will be on chill mode, the auditor will test less. This is what we mean by the inverse relationship to audit effort. Now, to further illustrate the auditor's risk response via the acceptable level of detection risk, we understand that the auditor responds by looking at or tweaking the nature, timing, and extent of his or her testing. What do we mean by this? When the acceptable level of detection risk is low, meaning to say the risk that you are willing to accept is low, that means the auditor must be taken on the stricter route or the stricter approach, yes? And if the auditor goes on the stricter approach, then the auditor will choose the nature of the procedures from less effective to more effective. Think about the choice between simply getting a certification versus actually doing the cash count. So if the auditor is strict, the auditor will insist on the cash count. That is if the acceptable level of detection risk is low. On the other hand, if the auditor takes on a stricter approach, meaning to say acceptable level of detection risk is low, then the auditor will endeavor to test the entire period under audit and will test as close to the balance sheet date as possible to ensure that the entirety of the audit period is covered. However, if the acceptable level of detection risk is high, meaning to say the auditor is on a relaxed mode, then the auditor may use interim testing. Lastly, when we talk about the extent, well, this has got something to do with the sample size and the actual testing of the auditor. So when the auditor is strict, meaning acceptable level of detection is low, then the auditor will endeavor to use a larger sample size as compared to when the auditor is in a relaxed mode, meaning acceptable level of detection risk is high, whereby the auditor can use a smaller sample size. So there you have it, risk assessment, risk response. And of course, later on, after the auditor has performed his or her testing, the auditor will then collate all of these results and will have to come up with his or her audit opinion. And that is what's going to happen under conclusion and reporting. But all for another concept map. And that's it. We have just effectively given the bite sized piece for financial statement audit, particularly risk based FS audit approach. So, to everyone, good job. Head on over to the next concept map, or you may want to answer some MCQs.